Welcome to Medieval History Channel 97, where the echoes of the past come alive. Step into the world of knights, castles, and forgotten legends as we journey through time together. Let history speak. Bloodlines can build empires or unravel them from within. He was born a prince, destined to inherit the mightiest throne in the Western world. His name was Don Carlos of Spain, grandson of the legendary Emperor Charles V, son of the formidable King Philip II. A child born not just into royalty, but into the crushing expectation of legacy. But Don Carlos never wore a crown. He never commanded armies, never ruled from a throne. Instead, he spent his final years behind a locked door, alone, emaciated, and unraveling. His body broke into ulcers, his limbs shivered with fever, and his mind, fragile, fraying, became a prison of voices only he could hear. Outside that door, the silence was not accidental, it was ordained. His father, the king, issued no proclamations, no pleas for help, only silence, secrecy, erasure, and eventually disappearance. Was he murdered, poisoned, slowly driven mad by isolation, grief, and betrayal? The truth was sealed behind stone walls. Today we look back, not to retell the story of a failed prince, but to mourn the slow, hidden death of a boy bred for power and broken by it. Don Carlos is not simply a royal tragedy, he is a human one. A boy who decayed not just in body, but in memory. Forgotten behind velvet curtains, buried not only in death, but in deliberate, suffocating silence. He was born on July 8, 1545, in the solemn city of Valladolid, Spain, a place steeped in ritual, superstition, and power. From the first breath he took, Carlos was more symbol than son. Heir to two empires, a child on whom the future was projected like a prophecy. His father, Philip II, was a monarch of rigidity and religious fervor, the so-called paper king, a man who ruled through documents, decrees, and divine right. His mother, Maria of Portugal, was not chosen for love, but for bloodline. She was Philip's first cousin, their marriage a transaction in the name of dynastic purity. The birth of a male heir should have lit the kingdom in celebration. But 4 days later, joy curdled into mourning. Maria died from childbirth complications, leaving the infant prince motherless, and Philip widowed and colder than ever. It was an ill-omened start. A life conceived in duty, shadowed by grief, and marked by the burden of survival. Carlos was never an ordinary child. Palace physicians whispered their concerns early. His skull was oddly shaped. One eye drooped. His limbs, subtly twisted, did not move in harmony. His walk never quite steadied. His temperament, unpredictable. He could be gentle, then violent, affectionate, then consumed by fury. Behind closed doors, nurses and courtiers traded uneasy glances. Yet to the outside world, he was the embodiment of strength and continuity, the symbol of Spain's golden lineage. When he was baptized, it was a grand affair. Incense-filled halls, noblemen from across Christendom, trumpets echoing off cathedral stone. A nation celebrated a future king. But beneath the embroidered robes, behind the gilded crib, lay a different truth, a fragile child. One who would never escape the contradictions of his birth, lionized in public, whispered about in private. He was not just born to rule. He was born to carry the impossible weight of empire on a body that could barely carry itself. And from the beginning, he was already breaking. By the age of 5, he was already unraveling. The fevers came first, relentless, burning through his small frame, leaving him shivering and soaked in sweat. Then the fits, wild, unpredictable spells that left his eyes blank and his limbs thrashing, as if some unseen force had taken hold of him. He would emerge from them dazed, sometimes violent, sometimes weeping, and always a little further away from the world. His tutors despaired. He couldn't concentrate, wouldn't obey, and seemed to flinch at even the gentlest correction. One called him sullen, another dangerously erratic. Some whispered of cruelty, others of madness. But the truth may have been crueler still. It may have been inheritance. Don Carlos was born into the House of Habsburg, a dynasty so consumed with maintaining its bloodline that it folded in on itself. Generation after generation of cousin marrying cousin, uncle wedded to niece, until the branches of the family tree became a knot. His parents were not just cousins, they were double first cousins. Both sides of his lineage traced back to the same roots, looping endlessly. The cost of that legacy was written on his body. Historians now suspect that Carlos suffered from mandibular prognathism, a condition that disfigured his jaw, a signature of the Habsburg line. But perhaps more devastating was the damage we could not see. deep neurological disturbances, psychological fragility, and a mind slowly splitting under the weight of itself. And yet, the expectations were monumental. He was the only legitimate son of King Philip II. There was no contingency, no alternate heir. Don Carlos was the future of Spain, whether his body or mind could bear it or not. So they dressed him in velvet and gold. They introduced him to ambassadors as a prince of promise. They placed him on councils, handed him ceremonial swords, and taught him the language of rule. The image was curated, immaculate, a boy destined to lead, a Catholic beacon in a world of shifting powers. But behind the scenes, that image crumbled. He disrupted mass with shrieking fits. He spat at advisors. He laughed in funerals and wept during banquets. Once, during a formal feast, he reportedly stabbed a nobleman in the hand for talking too loudly. At 14, he was caught mutilating animals. At 16, he nearly pushed a servant to his death from a palace balcony. His father was horrified, but not into action. Not the kind that might have helped. Instead of comfort or care, there was surveillance. Instead of therapy, there was silence. Because this was the Spanish court, grand, gilded, and deeply Catholic. It had rituals for everything except the human heart. Mental illness was heresy or punishment. Vulnerability was a liability. And Don Carlos, whatever he was suffering, became a threat to the very order he was born to preserve. As his behavior grew more erratic, courtiers began avoiding him entirely. Not out of cruelty, but fear. He was a prince, yes, but one who might erupt at any moment. Reports began to leak abroad. An Italian ambassador confided, "The prince is not fit to govern a dog, let alone a kingdom." Another, writing from Vienna, noted chillingly, "His eyes are like glass, cold, confused, as though he sees a world we cannot." Yet at home, the mask never slipped. The Spanish public heard only of his virtue, his strength, his unshakable future. But in the privacy of his locked chambers, the truth unfolded in shadows. He stopped eating food from the palace kitchens, terrified it was laced with poison. He drew grotesque sketches of death, of burning cities, of twisted faces. He whispered to invisible visitors. Some said he called out to his dead mother. Others said he prayed to saints who never answered. He was a boy losing himself, and no one reached for his hand. Whatever the truth may have been, one thing became heartbreakingly clear. The boy born to rule was slowly becoming someone no one could recognize, not even himself. In another world, perhaps Carlos could have been helped, given time, given care, given compassion. Perhaps he might have found healing in the quiet of a therapist's room, not the cold stone walls of a palace. But 16th century Spain knew no such mercy. It offered no safe harbor for the wounded mind. Only bloodlines, power, and the rigid inheritance of a throne that demanded strength without vulnerability, obedience without question, clarity without confusion. Don Carlos could offer none of these. And so the boy once hailed in church choirs, immortalized in gold leaf portraits, celebrated in royal decrees as the future of the empire, was soon hidden away. His world reduced to shadowed corridors, locked doors, and the echoing silence of abandonment. His descent into obscurity began not with scandal, but with something heartbreakingly ordinary, a misstep. In the spring of 1562, while ascending a narrow staircase in the royal palace, Carlos tripped. He tumbled violently down the stone steps, striking his head with a sickening thud. He lost consciousness instantly. Servants cried out. Courtiers ran in terror. Blood spread like ink beneath his ear. For hours, he lay unmoving, a prince between worlds. The royal physicians, bound by the crude science of the time, acted in desperation. They bled him. They burned herbs. They whispered prayers over his still body. But as the swelling in his skull worsened, they reached for a final, brutal resort. Trepanning, boring a hole into his skull to relieve the pressure. Somehow, whether by miracle or sheer refusal to die, Carlos lived. He opened his eyes days later. Dazed, changed. At first, there was joy. Bells rang across Madrid. A massive thanksgiving was held. The empire exhaled. Their prince had returned. But not all of him had come back. Whatever fragile balance once kept his mind tethered had been shattered. His behavior, always erratic, now spiraled into chaos. The boy they had once groomed to inherit a kingdom could barely govern himself. His rages burned hotter, came faster. He turned on those closest to him, accusing servants of assassination plots, threatening tutors, screaming at ghosts only he could see. When denied a simple pleasure, he starved himself in silence, locked behind his own fury. One courtier wrote with sorrow, his moods swing like the bells of a cathedral, gentle one moment, terrifying the next. He began to hoard strange objects, tore the heads from birds and dolls, refused to bathe, his skin breaking open with infected sores. He walked barefoot through marble halls, whispering that his shoes were cursed. He lashed out at his reflection. He clung to a crucifix like a drowning man, weeping for sins no one could name. And yet, beneath the madness, something else grew, a defiant sense of entitlement. As his mind fractured, his delusions of power solidified. He demanded to rule, declared himself king in letters signed Carlos Rex, while his father still reigned. He insisted on reviewing state matters, forcing his way into the machinery of an empire that had already begun to quietly edge him out. But the truth was inescapable. Carlos had become both a danger and a heartbreak, a mirror too painful to look into. He was the heir, the hope, the living promise of a future that now threatened to collapse under the weight of his mind. And the court, terrified of what he might do or reveal, chose silence over support, secrecy over compassion. And so the boy who had once been destined to rule was instead buried alive, not in earth, but in forgetting. This wasn't just a delusion, it was a danger. Spain teetered on the edge of collapse. In the Netherlands, Protestant revolts threatened to splinter the empire. France was drowning in religious war, and across the Channel, Elizabeth's England turned colder by the day. Philip II needed control, order, stability. Instead, he had a son unraveling before his eyes. Carlos's decline had breached the palace walls. He wandered the streets in clashing robes, muttering incoherently to priests, interrupting sacred processions with shouts. At a royal mass, he laughed, loudly, inappropriately, and demanded a saint's statue be removed, claiming its eyes followed him while he slept. It was no longer eccentricity, it was a threat. The father became the observer, the king became the interrogator. Philip II ordered secret inquiries. He read intercepted letters from his son's chambers, questioned doctors in hushed conversations. There was no single explanation, no neat diagnosis, but the consensus was unanimous. Don Carlos could not be trusted with a crown. The tipping point came when Carlos, in desperation, tried to flee. He reached out to Protestant nobles in Flanders, pledging to join their rebellion. He wrote of raising arms against his own father. It wasn't just madness now. It was treason. Philip read the letters with a breaking heart, but an unshaken will. The man who had once held his son as a baby now had to hold the fate of a kingdom. He chose the latter. No trial, no public spectacle, just whispers behind the velvet drapes of the Council of State. On the night of January 18, 1568, under a veil of silence, the king himself walked through shadowed halls, guards in tow. He entered his son's chamber. Carlos, roused from sleep, confused and panicked, asked what was happening. For your own safety, they told him. The door was locked, windows sealed, guards stationed, and in that moment, Don Carlos, heir to an empire, became a prisoner of his own blood. Rumors spread like wildfire through noble courts. Ambassadors penned frantic letters. What had happened? Had the prince lost his mind? Was he dangerous? Or was he betrayed? To the public, there was only a sterile line. The prince was ill and needed rest. But the silence concealed something far more haunting. In the days that followed, his room was stripped bare. No pens, no blades, not even curtains to soften the cold light. His world shrank to stone walls and shadowed figures. No voices but his own. No company but flickering ghosts of what might have been. A boy who once sat beside emperors was now left to speak with no one. A child born to command continents, left alone with the echoes of his mind. Philip II ruled not just Spain, but a vast empire stretching from the Americas to the far edges of the Philippines. He was the embodiment of divine right, of regal control, of unshakable will. And yet when it came to his own son, he chose silence. Not mercy, not understanding, just silence. And sometimes silence is the cruelest sentence of all. Don Carlos had become a question no one dared to answer. Yes, he was the heir to the most powerful throne in Europe, but he was also volatile, erratic, unraveling. His presence unsettled the court, his moods chilled the room. What once might have been dismissed as eccentricity now carried the weight of fear. Whispers swirled like smoke behind velvet curtains. Ambassadors exchanged uneasy glances. Priests clasped their hands harder in prayer. And King Philip, he did nothing. He watched, silent and unmoving, as his only son slipped further away. There were reports, always reports. Carlos refusing food, Carlos screaming in the night, Carlos sobbing without reason, raging without warning. Some said it was the echo of old head injuries, others blamed demons or divine punishment. And then came the most terrifying theory of all, that perhaps, just perhaps, the prince was truly mad. In any family, such a collapse would be devastating. But in a royal lineage, it was catastrophic. To admit that the future king was mentally unfit was not just a personal grief, it was a national threat. And still, the signs could not be ignored. By the close of 1567, Don Carlos had vanished from public life. He was no longer safe to be seen, violent, paranoid, lost in a fog of confusion. And so, in the first months of 1568, Philip made a choice that would leave a permanent scar on Spain's history. He did not have his son executed. He did not send him away. He did something colder. He locked him up. One winter night, under the heavy weight of secrecy and steel, Don Carlos was led through dim corridors to a sealed wing of the palace. There was no ceremony, no family, only guards, and a door that closed behind him and never opened again. No more chosen servants, no more trusted voices, just a narrow bed and silence. So much silence. The king claimed it was for Carlos's health, for the safety of the realm, but no explanation, however gentle, however polished, could cover the truth. Philip had imprisoned his son. Outside, the court issued careful statements about illness. Inside, the prince withered. He grew thin. He grew desperate. He asked for books. They were denied. He asked for his childhood attendant. Gone. He called out for his mother, long buried. No answer ever came. And Philip? He never came either. Some said it was fear. Others said it was guilt. But perhaps it was something worse. A decision had been made. The process had already begun. Don Carlos was being erased. What followed was not just cruelty, it was silence, cultivated and deliberate. 6 months of isolation, letters censored, visitors blocked. Even foreign kings were left in the dark, and yet the machinery of empire moved on. Philip met with ambassadors. He restructured the church. He built ships, prepared for war. To the world, Spain stood tall. But behind the palace walls, its crown prince was vanishing by degrees. Some said Carlos stopped speaking. Others claimed he screamed for hours, tore his garments to shreds, refused food until his body trembled. But we may never know the full truth. The records are few. Many were burned, some never written at all. Perhaps because, in the end, what mattered most was not what Carlos did, but what was done to him. What we do know is this. Carlos died in July of 1568. He was only 23. The official cause? Natural causes, they said. The unofficial truth? No one really knows. Some whispered of poison, murmured through the corridors with more fear than conviction. Others suggested suicide, a final act of despair in a life unraveling. Many believed his frail, tormented body simply surrendered. And what of Philip? He ordered mourning. For a time, black curtains hung like veils of guilt across the palace walls. Bells tolled in solemn rhythm. Priests chanted mass after mass. But the funeral came quickly, quietly. There was no grand procession, no marble monument, no elegy penned in gold, no stories sung by court poets, just another death in the House of Habsburg, only this one was buried deeper. Deeper in earth, deeper in shame, deeper in silence. And then, Philip never spoke his son's name again. In thousands of letters that remain, precise, cold, exacting in their tone, Don Carlos fades into near total absence. The boy who was once Spain's future became a ghost. A whisper no one dared utter, a blank space in the royal lineage. Why? Some say Philip's silence was grief in its rawest form. That the pain of watching his son collapse into madness carved a wound too deep for words. Others say it was calculated, a political erasure, done not out of heartbreak but necessity. To preserve the crown, to protect the myth of monarchy, grief or policy, perhaps both. But here's what we cannot ignore. Philip II, God's chosen ruler, the most Catholic king, guardian of empire and soul, chose silence. He could have chosen otherwise. He could have sought better healers, braver advisors, more light, more love. But he didn't. He closed the door. And for nearly 5 centuries, history has left it shut. By that fateful summer of 1568, the light in Don Carlos's chamber had withered to a flicker. The windows, small to begin with, were nearly always shuttered now. The sun no longer reached the stone floor. The only illumination came from trembling candles or the ghostly glow of a servant's lantern. The air inside the room was foul, not just unpleasant, unbearable. A choking stench of sweat, rot, waste, and spoiled food clung to the walls like a curse. Carlos himself had become unrecognizable. His once boyish face was hollowed, a mask of suffering stretched over bone. His cheeks were caverns. His skin, pallid and thin, marked with lesions, sores, the slow signature of decay. His fingers trembled without reason. His chest wheezed in shallow, stuttering breaths. The eyes, once so sharp, so alive, were distant now, glazed, as if staring inward at something he could not escape. But perhaps the most haunting part of all was his voice. The once defiant prince had become a ghost of himself, murmuring endlessly in broken threads, half-formed prayers, disjointed curses, shattered lullabies from a childhood that now felt like someone else's dream. Sometimes he cried out for his mother, the plea echoing through the stone corridors like a wound reopened. Other times his voice twisted into garbled Latin, fragments torn from old sermons, courtroom edicts, or the rituals of a world that no longer made sense to him. The veil between reality and delusion grew thinner by the day. He spoke to invisible figures, long-dead saints, phantom soldiers, demons only he could see. Once a guard heard him pleading for mercy, addressing his father not as "Your Majesty," but as something far more intimate and damning, "Judge of souls." He was convinced they were poisoning him, that the bread hid powdered bones, that the water was alternately sacred and cursed. Every footstep in the hallway, every groan of wood or shift of wind was a harbinger of death. He heard it coming. He welcomed it, feared it, begged for it. On the rare days when lucidity returned, it didn't bring relief, only terror. "I am rotting," he whispered once to a physician, eyes wide and hollow. "And they are letting me rot because I was never meant to be born." By July, his body had become a battlefield. The ulcers on his legs festered and wept, soaking the straw with foul-smelling pus. His temperature swung violently. Fever dreams one day, bone-deep chills the next. He would claw at his skin, screaming he was on fire, then shiver uncontrollably, lost beneath layers of cloth he no longer recognized as his own. He had wasted to near nothing. An attendant claimed he weighed less than a child. His wrists were thinner than a man's thumb. His heart stammered with no rhythm. His tongue, coated in white decay, made his words crumble as they left his mouth. And still he was not granted peace, not even in the shadow of death. King Philip, ever the strategist, refused to allow the last rites too soon. He feared the message it might send, that the heir was dying, that the throne was vulnerable, that rebellion might find its opening. Only when death was no longer a threat but a certainty did he relent. The Archbishop of Toledo was summoned. According to a hidden court record, Carlos was barely conscious when the priest arrived. His lips moved with desperate effort, but the sounds had no shape. The priest asked if he placed his trust in Christ. Carlos blinked once, a silent affirmation, or perhaps a twitch of nerves. When asked if he forgave those who had harmed him, he smiled, not with serenity, but with something broken, a smile not of peace, but of surrender. That night, blood erupted from his mouth. His body seized, limbs locking, chest rising and falling in frantic bursts that mimicked life but foretold death. The physician came too late. There was little he could do but watch. They bound Carlos's wrists so he wouldn't tear at his own skin. They pressed ice to his temples, a feeble ritual in the face of something unstoppable. And then at last, the struggle ended. He stopped moving. Not with fanfare, not with ceremony, just stillness. Don Carlos died on July 24th, 1568. He was only 23. There were no trumpets, no mourning bells, no national grief, no candle-lit procession winding through the cobbled streets of Madrid. Just a quiet, clinical notice from the royal court. The prince has succumbed to a long illness. That was all. No one wept in public. No statues were raised. His body, once destined to wear a crown, was treated like an inconvenience, wrapped hastily in linen, laid in a plain wooden coffin, and buried without ceremony in the cold, solemn crypt of San Lorenzo del Escorial. No public viewing, no memorial, no inscription. A prince locked away in life was now sealed in death with the same silence that had surrounded his final years. But silence does not mean peace. Behind that stillness, questions lingered, unspoken but corrosive. Had he been poisoned? Starved? Did Philip II engineer his slow decline, preferring quiet death to the spectacle of a royal execution? Or had Don Carlos simply unraveled body and mind under the unbearable weight of expectation and isolation? Beyond Spain, the world whispered. In Protestant England, in rebellious Flanders, pamphlets accused the king of filicide. Some made Carlos a martyr, a saint undone by royal cruelty. Others called him a mad prince, a tragic figure driven to collapse by confinement and betrayal. Inside Spain, there was only silence, tightly managed and fiercely guarded. Carlos's death was framed as a private sorrow, nothing more than the loss of a sickly boy. The court moved on. Philip returned to his empire. There was no pause, no reckoning, only the echo of what had been erased. But silence, though powerful, is rarely permanent. Years later, storytellers would bring him back to life, in operas, in poems, in paintings, each version shaped by its teller, a noble rebel, a misunderstood son, a warning, a myth, a ghost, and perhaps in some way he was all of these. But what cannot be denied is this: Don Carlos died as he lived, confined, misunderstood, and ultimately cast aside. Not with a blaze of glory, not on a battlefield, but in slow disintegration, as the hopes of an empire decayed within the four walls of a locked chamber. July 25th, 1568. The corridors of El Escorial were heavy with quiet, curtains drawn against the sun, servants whispering, and somewhere behind those velvet folds, the memory of a boy, once called heir, was already beginning to vanish. There was no proclamation, no solemn procession, no black crepe draped across palace balconies. The prince was dead, and the command was chilling in its simplicity. Do not speak of it. King Philip II, a man sculpted from granite and policy, didn't flinch. This was not the loss of a son. It was the elimination of a liability. He had choreographed every step of what followed. Not in mourning, but in method. Grief played no role here. Only power. Only silence. For the most commanding sovereign in Christendom, the death of Don Carlos was never a heartbreak. It was a political rupture, a hairline fracture in the marble image of divine rule, and it had to be sealed, swiftly, quietly. The official notice was brief, sanitized, devoid of soul. The most illustrious Don Carlos, Prince of Asturias, has succumbed to a lingering illness. We entrust his soul to God. That was it. No royal decree for mourning, no day of national lament, no candle-lit requiem echoing through the cathedrals of Madrid. Within days, his name was scrubbed from state records, erased as though he had been a passing shadow, a ghost the crown was too frightened to remember. But outside the palace walls, the silence spoke volumes. The world was listening and watching. In foreign embassies, whispers turned to dispatches. The Venetian ambassador wrote with veiled suspicion. There is no doubt the prince was confined. The terms of his death are cloaked in silence, and I suspect this is not born of piety. In Protestant lands, the tale ignited like wildfire. Pamphlets surfaced in the Netherlands and England, portraying Carlos not as a madman, but a martyr, a young, devout prince locked away and slowly murdered by a father whose faith had hardened into fanaticism. The Spanish court moved quickly, desperately. They denied the rumors. No cruelty, no neglect, no madness. But their silence had already spoken too loudly, and so speculation bloomed in the void. Some whispered he was stabbed in the dark, others that poison had been slipped into his food, day by day draining the life from him like ink from a quill. The most haunting version imagined a father watching his son rot behind locked doors and choosing, deliberately, not to intervene. Yet within Spain, another story quietly circulated. Behind closed doors, among the elite and the cautious, Carlos became something else, unstable, dangerous. A boy not merely broken, but threatening. Tales of his erratic outbursts, some rooted in truth, others cleverly embellished, were let loose like seeds in the wind. There were murmurs of treason, of heresy. Not loud enough to make headlines, just enough to settle into memory, just enough to make forgetting him feel like justice. And then, there was silence. The goal had been devastatingly clear: to convince the people that Don Carlos's death was not only justified, but necessary, even merciful. The machinery of erasure whirred into motion with ruthless precision. His portraits, once adorning palace walls, vanished in the night. Artists were instructed to abandon any likenesses of the prince. His belongings, the books he once touched, the clothes he wore, the letters he wrote, were either reduced to ash or hidden away in sealed archives, as if his very existence had become too dangerous to remember. What could not be destroyed was rewritten. He was sick. The king had no choice. It was for the good of Spain. The script was simple and disturbingly effective. In mere months, Don Carlos dissolved from public memory. The nation's gaze shifted outward, toward foreign wars, toward religious reform, toward the king's next dynastic marriage. The crown moved forward, polished and intact. The prince remained behind, not just in time, but in silence, his memory entombed in the very fortress that once held his broken body. But memory is not so easily buried, and the legacy of Don Carlos, stubborn, spectral, refused to die. In time, artists returned to him. Poets, playwrights, and composers resurrected his image, not as a lunatic, but as a tragic mirror of tyranny and silence. In Schiller's 18th century play Don Carlos, he emerged not mad but noble, passionate, defiant, crushed beneath the weight of betrayal. Verdi's opera would breathe new life into this ghost, painting him as a young man in love, in revolt, and in chains, undone not by madness but by the merciless machinery of empire. These portrayals were not historically faithful, but they were emotionally honest. They understood something the official record refused to, that Don Carlos was not a failure of mind, but a failure of mercy. A child born into unimaginable power, yet starved of love, watched but never trusted, groomed for glory but discarded without grief. His life became a sacrifice to the cold logic of empire, his death, the price of control. But fiction was not the only place his ghost returned. Historians, too, began to question the silence. Why was there no trial, no public acknowledgement of his death? Why was there no royal mourning, no monument, no funeral rites? And why would a king so obsessed with legacy choose to erase his own son? Some say it was dynastic paranoia, the Habsburg obsession with purity, perfection, and Catholic order. A mad prince was a blemish, a rebellious one, a threat. By making Carlos disappear quietly, Philip avoided the danger of a martyr, the stain of scandal, the fire of rebellion. Others suggest guilt, that Philip, bound by duty and shackled by his conscience, chose silence not out of cruelty but out of shame, that he could not bear to execute his son, and so he condemned him to vanish, slowly, painfully, behind locked doors and erased pages. But perhaps the most terrifying answer is also the simplest. That in a world where power ruled above all else, a fragile, volatile boy like Don Carlos had simply become inconvenient. Not a threat, not a tragedy, just an obstacle. And obstacles in the logic of empire are meant to be removed. His existence threatened succession. His behavior endangered foreign alliances. His death, quiet, clinical, solved a problem. The evidence of that cold, unsparing calculus still lingers in the archives of El Escorial. Not in royal proclamations, but in the mundane machinery of disappearance. Records of guards stationed outside his cell, medical notes chronicling his decay, and the king's own journal, detached, clinical, heartbreakingly devoid of grief. The prince refuses food again, one line reads. Bleeding continues from the leg, hallucinations persist, no improvement. And then without ceremony, the Lord has judged him. May God grant him peace. Not a father's sorrow, a ruler's verdict. The Spanish court may have buried the death of Don Carlos in silence, but history is never still. It does not rest, it does not forget. Restless and relentless, it exhumed the story piece by piece until the prince no longer remained just a cautionary footnote in royal succession. He became something else, a ghost, a myth, a mirror. A legend that would slip through palace gates, haunt the conscience of kings, and inspire revolt across borders. His resurrection began, not in courts or councils, but in whispers. From servant to traveler, court to tavern, the tale spread like wildfire. The prince went mad. The prince was betrayed. The king killed his own son. In Protestant nations, especially the Netherlands, already smoldering under Philip II's repression, Don Carlos became a symbol of Catholic cruelty, a boy martyr consumed by the very empire he was meant to inherit. Pamphlets depicted him as a gentle soul, crushed by the Inquisition, devoured by his father's icy hand. Rebel writers invoked his name as a battle cry, warning of monarchs who eat their own. In Catholic territories, the narrative was more cautious, more conflicted. Carlos was often remembered as ill, unstable, a tragedy, but a necessary one. Even sympathetic voices struggled to categorize him. He did not fit the mold of hero or villain. He was too volatile, too raw, too human, and perhaps that's why the artists came. In the late 18th century, German playwright Friedrich Schiller took up the name Don Carlos and turned him into a tragic hero. In his acclaimed play Don Carlos, the prince is reimagined not as a madman, but as a visionary, a reformer, a young idealist caught in the machinery of political tyranny. Schiller's Carlos burns with passion, with love for his stepmother Elizabeth, and with an aching desire for liberty in a world built on control. He was flawed, noble, and ultimately sacrificed on the altar of absolutism. Audiences were moved not by facts, but by feeling, by Carlos's helplessness, his yearning, his defiance. In Schiller's hands, the broken boy became something larger. The eternal youth crushed beneath the weight of empire, the dreamer who dared to resist a world that would not bend. Then, in 1867, the great Italian composer Giuseppe Verdi breathed new life into the myth. Taking Schiller's drama, Verdi transformed it into Don Carlo, a 5-act opera drenched in forbidden love, spiritual agony, and political betrayal. It was not the history of Spain, it was the truth of pain. And through music and theater, Don Carlos became immortal, not for the crown he never wore, but for the suffering he could never escape. Verdi's version introduced the world to a Carlos of immense emotional range, romantic, erratic, courageous, and ultimately destroyed by forces far beyond his control. In Don Carlo, the tragedy isn't simply his downfall. It's what that downfall symbolizes, the suffocation of personal liberty beneath the crushing weight of religious fanaticism and dynastic rigidity. Through Verdi's music, Carlos became more than a historical figure. He became a voice, aching, defiant, human. And through music and poetry, Carlos lived again. His agony now echoed through opera houses, his longing suspended in arias, his grief whispered on candlelit balconies. He became a melody of sorrow, carried across continents, centuries, hearts. But the prince also lingered in quieter, darker corners, those of historical re-examination. In the 19th and 20th centuries, historians began peeling back the layers of myth. With access to royal archives, personal letters, and medical notes, a more unsettling picture emerged. Not of a villain or a martyr, but of a tormented young man caught in a world that had no room for fragility. Modern psychological assessments, retroactively applied, suggest Don Carlos may have suffered from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, hallucinations, delusions, violent mood swings. His mind, already unstable, further compromised by a skull fracture sustained in 1562. His body weakened by starvation, self-neglect, inherited dysfunction. He was not just misunderstood, he was unwell, profoundly. In today's world, he would have been a patient, a candidate for lifelong care, therapy, and protection. But in 16th century Spain, he was something else, a threat, a royal embarrassment, a living contradiction to the myth of perfect bloodlines and divine right, a ticking bomb they chose to bury before it exploded. And yet, the more we understand his illness, the more his story begins to echo. Because Don Carlos is not just a chapter of royal misfortune. He becomes a warning about the cost of systems that exalt legacy over love, image over honesty, silence over support, about fathers who demand obedience instead of understanding, about courts that cover up illness instead of confronting it, about the human wreckage left when power chooses preservation over compassion. Even in visual art, Carlos's image haunts. In early portraits, he is pale, adorned in velvet, distant-eyed, a prince sculpted for duty. In later renderings, especially posthumous ones, the illusion shatters. His face is hollowed, shadowed, a figure draped in decay. The contrast is brutal, the public projection versus the private reality. And in literature, his ghost reappears, not always by name but by nature. The broken air, the boy in the tower, the silenced scream. Some even argue that Shakespeare drew inspiration from his story, for Hamlet's paralysis, for Lear's unraveling crown. Whether that's true or not, the parallels are undeniable. Power that isolates, vulnerability that damns, love withheld until it is too late. In Spain, Don Carlos remains a hushed name. His tomb rests in El Escorial among kings and queens, but without reverence. His portrait rarely shown, his story brushed aside in schoolbooks, and yet somehow he endures. Because Don Carlos speaks to something heartbreakingly universal. Not just about mental illness or monarchy, but about what it means to be forgotten, to be locked away, physically, emotionally, historically, and the aching need to remember what power once tried to erase. In the end, the most haunting truth about Don Carlos is not how he died, but what his death reveals. That even in golden palaces behind diamond crowns, there can live unbearable suffering, quiet, invisible, nearly lost to time, but not quite. The story of Don Carlos has long drifted through the shadows of legend, molded by myth, opera, poetry, propaganda, and the hushed tones of rumor. But peel back the layers of narrative, and what remains is something far more haunting and intimate. The slow, silent unraveling of a boy crushed not by blade or battlefield, but by expectation, by inheritance, and by abandonment. He was not slain by enemies, but by the impossible weight of what he was born to be. Centuries later, historians and medical researchers have returned to his story, not to romanticize it, but to understand it. Armed with tools his own physicians could never have imagined, they sift through records, clinical observations, personal letters, and royal commands. From this fragmented archive, a clearer image has formed, and it is no less tragic for being more precise. The consensus is grim. Don Carlos, it seems, was the inevitable result of a dynasty devouring itself. Generations of close intermarriage within the Habsburg line, cousins wedded to cousins, had amplified recessive genetic disorders to catastrophic levels. His maternal and paternal grandparents were siblings. His genome was a house of mirrors, collapsing in on itself. The diagnoses echo across time. Mandibular prognathism, the infamous Habsburg jaw etched into his portraits. Hydrocephalus, a cranial malformation, likely worsened by the fall in 1562. Seizures, basal dysfunction, possibly epilepsy, possibly something more, schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, suggested by the hallucinations, the delusions, the paranoia that consumed him. And layered atop all of it, metabolic or autoimmune conditions, starved further by poor hygiene, confinement, and neglect. His body and mind were deteriorating, and no one knew how, or perhaps dared, to help. In today's world, Carlos might have been diagnosed early, treated, surrounded by specialists, given medication, therapy, a chance, but in his own time there was only fear, only restraint, and eventually rejection. This was not merely a medical failure, it was a moral one. Carlos was never just a child. He was a symbol, an embodiment of empire, of God's will, of the eternal bloodline. His existence was not his own. He was expected to rule flawlessly, to lead, inspire, and continue a legacy that made no space for fragility. And when his mind began to slip, when he needed care more than command, the system that shaped him recoiled. It chose silence, chose control, chose to preserve the illusion of strength by sacrificing the boy who bore it. As courts so often do, it closed ranks, isolated the disturbance, silenced those who spoke too plainly, buried what did not fit the narrative. Carlos was not merely locked away, he was erased, erased from public life, erased from memory, erased from meaning. Long before his heart gave out, his identity was stripped from him, his dignity severed piece by piece. And yet, this is not a relic of the past. Across centuries and cultures, the pattern repeats. We exile the unstable, we hush the suffering, we disappear those who don't fit the mold, especially when they stand too close to power, to privilege, to the face we want the world to see. Even now, in an age that claims to understand mental health better than ever, stigma persists, especially where image is everything, especially where legacy is fragile. The tragedy of Don Carlos is not only in how he died, but in how familiar his story still feels. Don Carlos reminds us what happens when a human being is stripped of their humanity, when a life is seen not as a soul, but as a symbol, when sons are not held, but inherited, when pain is not witnessed, but hidden, when illness is not met with compassion, but with fear, shame, and silence. His story is not just a tragedy of monarchy, it is a mirror held up to every family that has turned away from the quiet unraveling of a child, to every government that crafts illusion instead of truth, to every institution that values dignity in appearance more than dignity in care. And yet, amid the darkness, there are still embers of human tenderness. A court attendant who remembered the prince's moments of gentleness, a physician who stayed even when met with rage and confusion, a priest who recorded a boy, alone in the end, clutching a crucifix and weeping, not for heaven, but for the memory of his mother. These fragments do not absolve the empire that broke him, but they remind us, inside the cold machinery of power, some still reached for him. And maybe, just maybe, in some final flicker of clarity, Carlos knew he had once been loved. Not well, not long, but once. History does not offer us neat conclusions. We cannot know if Philip II acted out of devotion, fear, or some rigid theology. We cannot say for sure if Carlos died from neglect or from the slow collapse of a body and mind already too fragile to endure. We may never know how much of the legend is truth, how much a mask, but we can say this: Don Carlos lived. He suffered, and his suffering was not fate. It was a choice made by those around him. A culture that worshipped bloodline more than well-being. A court that preferred secrets to scandal. A father who chose silence when his son needed a voice. And perhaps that is the most chilling lesson of all, that the true cost of power is paid behind closed doors, in locked rooms, in cries no one answers, in names history almost forgets. The tragedy of Don Carlos is not sealed in royal archives or operas. It lingers still in every overlooked patient, in every untreated illness, in every family that cannot speak the truth aloud. Because his story is not just about a prince or a madman. It is about the quiet, procedural cruelty of systems that fail the fragile. And in a world that still struggles with mental illness, with suicide, with how to protect the breaking, his life still speaks. Don Carlos was not just a royal figure, he was a person. And in the end, there were no bells, no mourning veils across the capital, no solemn processions through the streets, no monuments. His coffin bore no banner. His passing brought no public grief. He died as he lived, isolated, silenced, entombed in stone. And maybe that, more than the madness, more than the ulcers, more than the betrayal, is the deepest horror of all. But the quiet, the absolute, deliberate quiet that followed his death, a kingdom that turned the page, a father who turned away, a world that, for centuries, simply forgot. Because forgetting is a kind of execution too. It does not spill blood, but it drains meaning. It erases not only a person's name, but their suffering, their voice, their humanity. And it is, in many ways, the final insult to a life already stripped of so much. But history, like rot, has a way of resurfacing. It seeps through cracks in the marble. It whispers beneath layers of gold leaf and official silence. And the story of Don Carlos did not stay buried. It crept into letters smuggled between embassies, into poems murmured in candlelit salons, into forbidden plays that dared to ask, what if the prince was not mad? What if he was simply unloved? These retellings, romanticized as they may be, refuse to let silence win. They refuse to let the locked chamber become his only legacy. They reminded us that once there was a boy in a tower, that behind the palace walls someone screamed for help, and no one came. That power, for all its splendor, can be utterly powerless to save a soul from despair. And so we are left with questions. What does it mean to inherit a crown but never wear it? To be born into command, yet be denied control over your own body, your own mind? To die not in battle or glory, but in confusion and fever in a bed soaked with blood and regret? Don Carlos forces us to confront the brutal truth behind so much of history's pageantry, that behind every portrait there is a person, that power isolates, that legacy demands silence, that sometimes what we call madness is simply a cry no one wanted to hear. And what of the father? King Philip II, builder of empires, slayer of heresies, patron of cathedrals, what did he feel in those final hours? Did he hesitate when he signed the order that locked his son away? Did he whisper his name again even once after death? Or was that too swallowed by the machinery of rulership? History offers no answers, only shadows. Perhaps the greatest punishment for a king is not rebellion, but remembrance. That despite all his power, the story that lives on is not his, but the son he chose to silence. In this way, Don Carlos wins something in death he never had in life, a voice, a legacy not built on titles or conquest, but on raw, terrible, unforgettable humanity. So let his story echo. Let it remind us that behind every locked door, every sealed record, every erased name, there may be a Don Carlos, a soul screaming to be seen, a life that mattered, not because he was prince, not because he was Habsburg, not even because he suffered, but because he was human. And that, in the end, is always worth remembering. Thank you for watching. If stories like this move you, if you believe history's forgotten deserve to be heard, please consider subscribing, liking, and sharing this video. We tell these stories not to glorify pain, but to give voice to those who were denied one. Until next time, stay curious, stay compassionate, and remember, not all the dead are buried in silence. Don Carlos died without a crown, without a coronation, without even a public eulogy. But in the quiet corridors of European memory, his legacy still lingers, uneasy, unburied. And unclaimed, he is remembered not in gold leaf or stone statues, but in operas, oil paintings, and tragic scripts. He appears not on coins, but in cautionary tales. His name is invoked not to glorify monarchy, but to question it. And perhaps that is his final act of rebellion. Because the truth is, Don Carlos was never meant to rule, Not because of his madness, not because of his blood, but because of what he represented, a fracture in the system, a contradiction within the myth of divine right. A boy who revealed, simply by existing, that the perfect machine of empire could break from within. His life exposed a painful paradox at the heart of hereditary rule, that the same bloodline meant to preserve order can also birth chaos, that the heir can be the threat, that sometimes the greatest enemy to a king is his own son. And in this way, Don Carlos becomes not just a historical figure, but a symbol for every child crushed beneath the weight of expectation, for every mind dismissed as mad when it simply needed care, for every story that was buried because it was inconvenient. In the centuries since his death, Carlos has been painted as many things: a madman, a martyr, a rebel, a romantic. But what is perhaps most remarkable is what remains missing: a grave worthy of his story. He was buried quietly, no royal mausoleum, no chapel bearing his name. His tomb in El Escorial remains unmarked, hidden in the still darkness of the Pantheon of Infantes, far from the gilded crypts of crowned kings and queens whose names are sung in marble and light. And yet, that obscurity speaks. It tells us something unsettling, something dangerous. That the most enduring legacy is not always the one that wins battles or expands empires, but the one that dares to question the foundations upon which power is built. In death, Don Carlos became what he never was in life: a threat. Not to armies, not to kingdoms, but to myth, to illusion. His name may have been stricken from royal records, but memory has a longer reach. It slips through cracks, clings to ruins, echoes down the centuries. Not entirely forgotten, and certainly not forever. Now, in the 21st century, new eyes look back at the bones of empire. Historians, psychologists, genealogists, they do not search for blame, they search for cost. Don Carlos becomes a case study, in collapse, in denial, in silence, a broken chain of care, a family that could not hold its own fragility, a court that chose reputation over responsibility. But he is more than a diagnosis. He is a warning signal, a human message sent through time, about what happens when empathy is exiled from power. In a world still struggling with mental illness, with authoritarianism, with legacy and shame, his life feels hauntingly present. His confinement still echoes in every ward where the suffering are hidden away. His name still speaks for every child denied help because the truth would be too shameful. His silence is shared by anyone who has been told, "Don't speak of it. No one would understand." But what if we did understand? What if we stopped burying these stories? What if we faced them, tenderly, honestly, without turning away? What if we remembered that institutions, past and present, are not made only of laws and bloodlines, but of human hearts, fragile, wounded, needing care? So this is what we leave you with. Don Carlos did not need to be king to matter. His worth was never found in titles or crowns. He mattered because he suffered, because his suffering was preventable. Let his story be a mirror and a warning that silence is not safety, that strength is not the absence of pain, and that any kingdom, be it nation, family, or self, that refuses to face its own shadows will one day be devoured by them. Soft, ambient music returns. In the end, Don Carlos was not destroyed by madness or illness or plots. He was undone by forgetting, by a father who feared him, by a court that could not bear his truth, by a world that found it easier to discard the inconvenient than to heal the broken. But if you've made it to the end of this story, if you're still here, then perhaps, in some quiet, defiant way, he has been remembered, seen, heard, and for someone who died in silence, that is no small resurrection. Thank you for listening, for remembering, for refusing to let the forgotten stay lost. Did this story resonate with you? Did the silence surrounding Don Carlos speak to something deeper in your own heart? His tale is not just one of royalty or ruin. It is a mirror held up to how we treat pain, vulnerability, and forgotten lives. If you felt moved or even haunted by what you've just heard, you're not alone. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. And before you go, don't forget to send your goodnight wishes to him. To the boy behind the palace walls, may he finally rest in peace.